Good evening. My name is Tamara Aberle. I'm the Program and Membership Lead at the British-German Association. We are delighted to have you in our audience tonight for this event on a new world order. I'm gonna introduce our panel of speakers in a moment. Just as a quick note on technology, if you have any questions throughout the discussion, you can put them either in the chat at the bottom of your screen or in the Q&A box. And you can also raise your hand and I will allow you to speak the question if that's your preference. Our speakers tonight, the panel is moderated by Dominic Johnson, who is Foreign and Africa Editor at Taz, die Tageszeitung in Germany. And we have two speakers who are Professor Richard Whitman. He is a specialist in UK and EU foreign and security policy and professor at the University of Kent. He's also a senior associate fellow at RUSI. And Evie Aspinall is director of the British Foreign Policy Group, where she focuses on the UK's role in the world and public attitudes to foreign policy. Yes, and now I'm handing over to Evie to start our discussion tonight.
Hello, and thank you very much for joining us on what at least in the UK is a very sunny evening. So much appreciated for you for joining us. So kind of to start off, we've each got a few minutes to set some of the scene, and I think my key kind of takeaway is that as the kind of headline of the session says, is we are in a new world order. I definitely think we can say we're maybe not yet in the new world order, but we're heading towards one. I think we can't overstate the extent to which the global order is in flux. We're in a period of major global instability, and global power is shifting, and so are global alliances. And I think the key thing for this is that this isn't just about Trump. So those shifts and changes we were seeing in the global order predate Trump. They're about the wider rise of China, more multipolar world that we're seeing, the rise of middle ground powers, places like India, Indonesia, who will become and are becoming increasingly important. Within this context, we're seeing a US that is responding by retrenching. And again, that predates and will outlast Trump. We saw this under Biden as well to a much less extreme extent, but nevertheless, we are seeing a US that is retreating from the multilateral order that it helped build, and increasingly concerned about some of its alliances and partnerships that it has built along the way. This is a particular challenge for the UK because we are very intertwined with the United States, be it on military and intelligence, multilateralism, even how we are perceived in the world. The UK soft power is very tied up with the United States. And for us, I think the challenge is twofold. One is that our values increasingly don't align with those that the US government is enacting into the world and what that says by our continued partnership with them. And also that the United States is no longer a reliable international partner. Again, I think that will outlive Trump as a challenge that we face. So we see that the UK is therefore increasingly looking towards Europe. The UK government has been very committed to a reset with relations, and that again was beginning before Trump as well. But actually, Trump has helped make some of that space possible, particularly when it comes to public opinion. So, whereas in 2024, 59% of Brits thought that the UK-EU relationships is now 59% of Brits now think the UK-EU relationship is more important than the UK-US one, compared to 40% in 2024. So we've seen a big shift in recent years. And when we look at kind of some of the recent agreements between the UK and the EU, they've been very popular in the UK, even surprisingly among Leave voters. So 78% of Leave voters support closer cooperation with the EU on defence and security, and 70% support closer cooperation around trade barriers. So we are seeing a kind of shift in momentum and public opinion around relations with Europe. And that doesn't mean it's straightforward and easy. There are lots of questions around trade-offs where politicians and the public all get a little bit more nervous here in the UK and also in the EU as well. And we've seen that recently around negotiations around defence, where in principle everyone's on board, but when it comes to it in practice, it's never quite so simple. And so for the UK, I think it's really important that it has allies within the EU. And for us, Germany increasingly seems to be one of those. Defence has been an area which Germany has kind of rapidly got to grips with in a way that is really helpful and constructive for the UK as we look towards European security. And Germany's become increasingly a champion for the UK as a key partner within Europe. There might not be enough to take the rest of the EU with it, but it's an important trend that we are seeing. And so I think there's some real positivity in the UK-Germany relationship, even as the UK-US relationship becomes increasingly challenging. So I'll leave it there, and then we'll have lots more discussion later on.
Well, thank you, Evie, and I'll pass straight on to Richard for his opening comments.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and my thanks to Evie for doing such a fantastic job in dealing with, you know, the big themes, and I think superbly setting out that state of flux that we find ourselves in. I'll try and add to the misery, and rather than perhaps repeat, and perhaps pull things in a little bit, and pick up on some of the themes that Evie raised about Europe and Europe's place in the world. I mean, clearly, all of the global trends that Evie identified are things that Europeans and things that the UK and Germany can't isolate themselves from. But I think compounding things really for Europeans is that we've moved from a situation in which, you know, we were a very ordered part of the globe. I mean, we often used to present ourselves as being contrastive to some other regions because of the multiplicity of arrangements we had, institutional arms control, and so on and so on, and really offered ourselves up as something of a model in terms of our particular corner of international relations, offering some lessons for others, but also, you know, representing, you know, how a focus on peace and prosperity was really very beneficial for the constituent states, but also for publics. And I'm afraid to say, you know, that we don't look like that anymore. Obviously, we've moved from a sort of European order to something of a state of European disorder. And you can see that, I think, primarily in what we call the European security architecture, which is all those institutions, agreements, and ways of operating that used to help us provide for our security. Those are really either non-existent or are operating in most cases in fairly suboptimal ways. And that's primarily, of course, because, you know, the Putin regime decided to launch a state-on-state war in Europe, a war of choice. But that's had a major implication, I think, for the way that we might map Europe, which is that Ukraine has moved from the periphery of Europe to its centrality in terms of European security. But that in itself, and not just the war, has kind of had a displacing effect in terms of Euro-Atlantic security and how those institutions might actually operate. So, you know, arms control and confidence building measures, many of those institutions that we built in the Cold War, like the OSCE, for example, have been put to one side. And whereas NATO has sort of, you know, in a way refound its purpose in terms of focusing on Russia, it's now has a bit of a question mark against it because of the Trump administration that I'll come on to in a moment. So to add to Evie's sort of flux, I want to sort of posit this idea that we've got a state of disorder, but we're also in a kind of interregnum. And, you know, interregnums are much loved by historians. You know, they're periods in which it's not necessarily clear what the future is going to look like. But one of the things we can be reasonably clear about is that the old European security order is gone, really dynamited, I think, by Russia. But also the US has moved away from an active and leading positive role in its management. So for Europeans, where the US sits is a key indeterminate, and that's really painful for both the UK and for Germany. You know, states which have both considered themselves to have a special kind of relationship with the United States. I didn't say special kind of relationship in both cases. But the sort of stated indeterminacy seems to be the kind of the new normal. And that raises a really big challenge for Europe's states and Europe's institutions. And if you want to kind of focus in on that, and you want to think about it just in terms of military security terms, it's really for Europeans now to ask themselves, what they can provide in terms of their own security in the sense which the US used to provide it, not just the means to do so, but how to command and to organize as the forces to do that, and also to think quite hard about the issue of nuclear deterrence and how Europeans might sit. And for the UK, a kind of really open and difficult question is part of this order, this new security order, is clearly the EU, and where the UK sits within that is an unresolved question. I have a view, and maybe we can get back to that in the subsequent discussion, but I just want to make two more quick points, if I may, perhaps to provoke your questions. The first is what I would call, the sort of the stampede towards minilateralism. We now have lots and lots of minilateralism in Europe. We've got things like the E3, which bring Germany, France together with the UK. We've got the E5. We've got other sort of defense formats like the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force. We've got cooperation amongst the Nordics, Nordefco, and I could go on and on and on. But we've got this great flowering of minilateralism, and there is a question as to whether this is the best way to organize ourselves diplomatically and security terms, or is the future flexilateralism? We move between these minilateralisms and the multilateralisms, and we've got to work out a way of making that work. And I'm happy to elaborate on that in due course. The other issue, which I think is a very uncomfortable one, is what you might call the renationalization of security cultures and approaches towards national security, and Germany is a manifestation of that. In that, for very good reasons, and I think for the collective good. Germany is thinking much harder about its own security and defense and the role of Germany in Europe. Other states are doing the same and have done the same, such as Poland. But this also has to be accommodated to our sort of collective security, and where's the best place to do that, and how best to organize it. And in the past, we tended to rely on the United States to help us, and did a lot of that big thinking, and Europeans took on roles for themselves, but we haven't got that, or we're moving away from that. So where's the best place and space for us to think about that? Is it a sort of new NATO? Is it the EU? Is it some other arrangement? Discuss. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard, for that, and Evie also for these very stimulating comments. Just a reminder to everyone, please post your questions in the chat if you have any, so we can engage, and that's the easiest way for me to see them. In the meantime, listening to you from Berlin and Richard saying that Germany is asking itself a lot of questions, it's absolutely right. And as far as I'm aware, they are still looking for the answers. And the German debate is increasingly, I think you have to see it through the angle of not being able to influence events. I think from here it's very much the perspective that things are happening which you can't really do much about, especially the Iran war, but also the way that Trump muscled into the Ukraine war. And Germany hasn't found an active role in dealing with that. And I wanted to ask both of you, we've had much more joint action from London and Paris, Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron jointly chairing summits and proclaiming that there are coalitions of the willing, first in Ukraine last year, although nothing came of that, and now with Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, and some kind of joint military action once the war is over. All of that is being very much piloted jointly by the UK and France. Do you see that as a model for closer UK-European cooperation in security issues, or is it more of an ad hoc thing in which the two countries with the most experience in these matters are forging ahead?
Shall I jump in there? I think it's a really interesting question because it is striking the extent to which we've seen the UK and France cooperating in recent months. I think there are two angles to it. One is that both the UK and France have historically been leaders and are much more comfortable than anyone else in Europe, I think, including Germany, in having that role. And actually, if you look to their populations as well, there is an expectation in both countries that they will lead from the front in a way that I don't think there is quite to the same extent in Germany. In fact, there's more of a discomfort with a kind of a leadership role for Germany. Whereas in the UK particularly, there's a lot of questions of what's Keir Starmer doing? Why aren't we doing more? Always a sense that we should be influencing. So I think there's partly that. I also think there's a personnel thing, which is that Keir Starmer and Macron seem to get on quite well. And so they seem to be quite aligned in their values. And so you're seeing these kind of ad hoc things form. I think that's a good thing. I think it's really good that we are seeing some degree of European cooperation and coordination, particularly when we're seeing such demands from the US for that, even if it's not always doing exactly what Trump would like. It's useful to kind of for him to see that Europe can start to kind of lead on its own 2 feet. I think Germany will increasingly be involved in those conversations as it kind of wrestles its own identity around that. And there are other countries too. Poland, I think, is a really important partner in a lot of this. And when it comes to actual military interventions, etc., there are other countries that will be more and more important. Whereas the UK and France, I think, have a good position when it comes to diplomacy that they are used to doing it and are leveraging at this point in time.
Richard, anything from you?
Thanks, Dominic. I think it's a great question, and your perspective on Germany is super interesting for us. I mean, the Franco-British thing is interesting because it's a kind of coalition of austerity, right? That both parties are more than capable to provide what is sometimes called in the UK thought leadership, and quite willing to do that, but don't possess the resources to make an impact, shall we say? And in that sense, Germany is really interesting. Obviously, if it does follow through on its commitments to spend, then it will be alongside Poland, our two, and Ukraine, I should say, our three major military powers in Europe, frankly, if I could phrase it in those terms. Which is quite an extraordinary change or state of affairs, I would have thought, from the position certainly that Britain has thought about itself in the past, and I think also France. And so it's great, that if you think about the relationship between Britain and France, as Evie said, seems to be working relatively well. I mean, it's been a work of imperfection in the past, but it's certainly a reasonably good working relationship now. And I think, the Anglo-German relationship, as Evie also said earlier, is obviously in a much better place than it has been for quite some time. The Franco-German relationship, I will let you comment on, Dominic, but as an outsider, it looks to be suboptimal at the moment. My worry in all of this is that with these sort of formats, we've got coalitions of the willing and all that, this is sort of organized ad hocery. And it's great to have a rush to organize yourself for these purposes, I think largely in response to the United States, to make it look to the US as if we're doing something. But I mean, the essential political problem for us now is that on Ukraine, the US is not our ally. It's set itself up in a different position. It's set itself up as a peace seeker, and it's set itself up as a party that stands between Russia and Ukraine and seeks peace between them, which is a great shift from what we had under the Biden administration. And in doing that, it's also cut Europeans out in terms of certainly peace seeking through the processes that the Trump administration has undertaken. But it also puts Europeans in the place in which they are now, the primary supporters for Ukraine, and how we stay the course, and how we might organize ourselves to stay the course, I think is the big sort of European strategic challenge, frankly.
But before I come to the question which has been asked, just directly to Richard, organized ad hocery, isn't that actually quite useful to be capable of in the age of Trump, where you never know what's going to be the war of the month?
It is, and I think actually for the British, it's a lot better than pursuing promiscuous bilateralism, which has always been a temptation of the British in the past, where we perhaps haven't committed to a group of countries in a way that we have. So, yes, I think you're right. There's something to do with that flexibility. But I mean, if we're serious about the political commitments we've made to Ukraine, I mean, the United Kingdom signed a 100-year treaty with Ukraine, then I think we need some institutions that are built for that sort of long-term support, particularly if we're finding it difficult to integrate Ukraine into the existing security and defense structures, meaning NATO.
Okay, I'll come on to the question which has been asked. I don't know if you can all see it. I'll read it. As it becomes even more clear that the UK has lost the will and capacity to take meaningful military action, it is surely inevitable that Germany assumes the position of military lead in Europe, jostling with France for supremacy. How smooth do you think this transition of power will prove to be? That's quite a loaded question. I'm not sure I agree with the presumption, but well, maybe you do, and you have something to say. Who wants to start?
Like go, Richard. I also don't think I necessarily agree with the core of the question. Um, I would say yes, the UK hasn't led from the front when it comes to military action, even if it has some kind of more diplomatic routes, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. Um, I think Germany, as it kind of looks towards remember it's working from a much lower base when it comes to kind of military capabilities and military investment. As it starts to make those investments, it will have some of those same challenges which the UK is having, which is, the questions around military spending versus welfare spending, etc. So I think actually, in many ways, all three countries will have very similar challenges. And so I don't think there's necessarily inherently a transition of power. And actually, in reality, if there was a very severe threat, if, the UK got invaded by Russia, not going to happen. But if, threats intensified quite dramatically, you would see the UK moving as quickly as Germany and France. And I think any threat to any of those countries would be a threat to all three, and they would all move quite quickly to remilitarize and strengthen their capabilities in that sense. So I don't think there's necessarily a transition of power. I do think Germany is probably coming up to be alongside the UK and UK and France, and I think that's broadly pretty welcome, especially in a world where the US is retreating so rapidly. I think we all recognize that we need as many friends and partners as we can. So the more we can encourage everyone to work together, the better for us all.
Richard.
I wouldn't phrase the question in quite that way, but I think it's a good and useful provocation, because one of the things that Germany's partners have to think about is what are the consequences for them of Germany spending what it plans to spend on defence, and particularly for Europe's larger traditional military powers, how they accommodate themselves, perhaps not having that league table leading position that they've had in the past. It's not, for me, a cause of anxiety. I think it's more a cause or opportunity, frankly. And for me, I would not want to be absorbed with anxieties about Germany, when my real anxieties are about how we support Ukraine, and to support Ukraine, that means all of us working in efficient ways to work with Ukraine, and my concern is primarily that we don't waste the political momentum that we have to build up Europeans' collective security and defence, and we do it in the smartest possible ways. But again, those who follow Germany's public spending habits will be better placed perhaps to talk about whether they think that Germany will spend that money wisely and in a way that will sort of enhance Europeans' security collectively, which is my great hope. And that's why I get excited when I see those figures, especially being a Brit, when, you know, we couldn't come close to spending the kind of money that Germany plans to spend.
If I can come in, I'm not even sure that Germany is prepared to spend that kind of money. The same constraints as everywhere, and certainly there is no appetite here to assume the position of military leader in Europe. I don't think anyone wants that. The traditional German position has been that we provide the money for the French to do things, and possibly the UK if it's in a joint European way, but we let them do it. And now two things have changed. One is that the money isn't there, and the other is that Germany will find itself in the front line if you look towards the east, and they're not quite sure how to handle that. These are very interesting debates. There are two further comments, questions, which I will just read. One is, I have one question regarding the change and the emerging new normality. There are some recent studies pointing out that although there is a significant change in public opinion regarding topical issues, i.e. regarding Putin and Trump, there seems to be rather marginal or significant change in opinion regarding more fundamental issues like transatlantic relations, commitment to multilateralism, or the EU as a civilian power. These findings apply especially to Germany, but please elaborate on EU as well. What is your assessment about these findings? And then there is a second question coming from Ankara. Thanks for this most interesting seminar. I would be happy to listen to your views on a Europe without NATO. How would Turkey fit into such a European security architecture? Thanks a lot. I think these questions are possibly linked in a way as to where Europe is going as a whole. And the Turkey question is, of course, important. Is it part of it or not? Maybe Richard, you would like to start on this one.
Thank you. I should say that I keep going from darkness to light because they've just installed lights in my office that go on and off depending on whether I move or not. So my apologies if it looks as if I keep having my photograph taken. Evie, I'm sure will have some interesting things about public opinion to say and where public opinion may be. But if I could just tackle a couple of issues in there. I mean, you know, it's a fascinating question is where the EU will be. I mean, you know, the EU has moved into a different space rather from the one it's occupied previously. I mean, I think it's quite difficult really to call it a civilian power anymore, particularly now it's committed on the defence side and you know, to use EU money on defence, right, which is, you know, broken very, very big taboo. But it's not an entity that's designed for war fighting, frankly. It's designed for the other end of the business, which is peacekeeping in a very grand sense. So that gets me to the question about, you know, Europe without NATO and Europe with Turkey and what the configuration looks like. It's difficult to imagine a future without NATO, but I think it's now possible to imagine a future without the US playing the preeminent role that it's played in NATO historically. And the challenge for Europeans, I think, is probably going to be how do you turn an organization like NATO, which operates on the basis of consensus formally, but has had, you know, one state really providing the political direction, into an organization that does all the things that NATO is intended to do in terms of collective security and defense, but doesn't have the United States playing the role that it's had in the past. And whether that's a viable proposition, and whether you can hold that coalition together, you know, in NATO, which includes the US. I have a personal bugbear with the idea of a European pillar of NATO as a proposition, because I don't think it works, and I also don't think it accurately reflects the kind of NATO we want. I mean, if you want a kind of NATO, you want a sort of reverse takeover of NATO by Europeans, not a European pillar of NATO, because, you know, Europeans really want the whole kit and caboodle. They want the whole thing, but to work in a way that works perhaps with having a US commitment that's less than it has been in the past. And to make it work, it needs Turkey, and it needs Norway, and it needs the UK, and it needs all the other existing members of NATO. But that's where we obviously have a dislocation between, one large European organization that excludes Turkey, Norway, and the UK, and another organization that doesn't, and the misalignment of the memberships of those organizations.
And while you were speaking, someone brought up Poland, which is an increasingly important player. As contribution says, Poland seems to be more realistic and ambitious with respect to building up its defense spending. Will Poland play a much more important and central role? I assume you would agree that it would.
Yes, I don't want to take some of Evie's time, but I think the answer is yes. And the really interesting thing about, I think, European security is that, with the enlargement of NATO to Finland and to Sweden, and what is a kind of a coalescing Northern European distinctive identity on security and defense, I would say, stretching from the Nordic Baltic region out to the UK. Sort of the thing that's represented by the GEF, the question is, Germany, Poland naturally fits within that as well. And how does it best fit? And then how does that connect to, the broader configuration of European security? But, if you were to imagine a scenario, and it would be a painful and incredibly difficult one to manage, in which NATO did fall apart, then I can actually see some parts of Europe that already coalesce and sit quite comfortably together, because they have a very similar shared strategic outlook, a similar strategic culture, in their approach towards Russia and what needs to be done. And there's then a very interesting question as to where Germany would sit within that, I think. But that's a scenario I don't want to contemplate, but one I think that would keep me awake at night if I thought about it too much.
Okay, Evie, would you like to come in on that? And also this this idea of a Europe with more and more important players who are possibly not all singing from the same hymn sheet. It does raise questions.
Yeah.
What do you say?
I think it's really positive to see so many countries stepping up, and well, a sign of the kind of very dangerous times in less positive framing. But it does create challenges, and there will be other countries, Hungary perhaps less so than it has been, but if you look at Hungary within the EU has been a real challenge. And across the world, the Europe particularly, we are seeing a rise of populism, which is particularly right-wing populism, which is a major challenge for the alignment of Europe across the board, and our ability to have a cohesive approach to foreign policy. So I think that's a real challenge we face. I wanted to touch on the question around public opinion, because I think it's really interesting. It's not research I've seen, and I'm not sure it's reflected in the UK. So I'd be really interested to see it. If anyone could send me the link, that would be great. Partly because in the UK there has been, initially it begun as like a temporary "we don't like Donald Trump" trend, but actually we are now seeing that spreading quite deeply into an anti-US trend more broadly, partly because people are fed up with this kind of yo-yoing of US foreign policy and the UK-US relationship. So I think that's really interesting. I also would be interested to see if it's reflected across Europe, this kind of more concerning trend I think you see, which is a decline in commitment to democracy, particularly among young people, which is a dangerous trend, and it's kind of undermining of if we are looking to a world where we're seeing more options and a potential for conflict, a real challenge around whether people will come out and fight for our country and for our values and who we are. And I think that's a real challenge we should all kind of be cognizant of and wary of.
Yes, and of course, it's entirely possible that France might have a far-right government in a year's time. And I noticed in one of your publications you said there should be a national conversation about security and defense spending. And I'm trying to imagine that kind of conversation being dominated by Nigel Farage and Zach Polanski, and wondering where that will go.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in the UK it's a real challenge where we've kind of accepted that, within the three kind of main traditional parties, there's been there's a disagreement whether we should be in the EU, but the foreign policy is broadly kind of consistent and in the middle. And actually now we have two populist parties who won't be in the same government, but either one of them could quite likely be in the next government, both of whom, for example, aren't particularly committed to NATO, less committed to Ukraine than you would like to see. And so there are real challenges in the UK as to whether we can be seen as a reliable partner in the next few years. And I think that's the case across a lot of Europe, which does make all of this quite challenging because you can't always predict where any of us will go.
There is, of course, an alternative scenario, which is that things get better by themselves. And there are a few questions in that sense. One asking, it's evident that the transatlantic relations have been massively affected under the Trump administration, which definitely has security implications for Europe. Are we hoping that relations will be restored after the Trump presidency, or will it be the same? And someone else asking, I read today that Marco Rubio might well be the next Republican presidential candidate. If he were to be elected, would NATO be in a better place? Do you have answers?
I think on my side, I would say that the as I sort of alluded to at the start, that a lot of this predates Trump. Trump is very much an extreme, but these are trends that we were seeing before Trump and we'll see after him, assuming there is an after. And like one of the very small but non-insignificant chances is that we struggle to get rid of Trump in the next election. And he's already making some fairly undemocratic moves, so that's the thing we should be aware of. It could also be someone like JD Vance next, who, again, I think will be less unpredictable than Trump, which is good, but doesn't mean that the kind of broad trends wouldn't be there. And if you've got a Democrat, you would expect that it would be a less extreme version, but you would still see pressure, for example, on Europe when it comes to NATO. I think the US leadership in NATO is probably over, regardless of who the next president is. And we are all now planning for that scenario where the US is much less involved in NATO and in European security. So I do think that, yes, there is a more positive, which is that I don't think the next person will be as unpredictable as Trump. But I do think to some extent these trends will continue either way, and we should be preparing for that.
Richard, what do you think? The world after Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think Evie's absolutely right that, I mean, because it's not just the political leadership, it's, societal and other changes in the US that are taking the US into a different place than it has previously. And, that the US faces an all fronts challenge from China that it didn't even face during the Cold War. So I think this is a new situation for the US to be in, and its model of capitalism is also developed in a direction that complicates the way that it relates to the world outside, and and Trump's way of approaching politics and his way of approaching the US national interest is obviously distinctive, shall we say. But I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that future administrations will share many of the concerns that he has, and particularly the concern with China. I mean, I also, in my darker moments, worry about Russia because, Russia, in a way, to us now is a sort of, known threat. And we are preparing and organizing ourselves for how we deal with the Putin regime. But, Russia is also a society that could go in interesting places, shall we say, if you see the demise of Putin and the power structure which is in place there. And that would put Europeans in a very difficult place, I would have thought. Obviously, we might hope for a different regime in Russia, which is more accommodating to Europe's security order, but we may find one that's even more problematic with the disorder. And my sort of thinking sometimes about what the coalition of the willing should do is actually prepare for the peacekeeping mission we might need to have in Russia if Russia falls apart, as opposed to how we can best support Ukraine on the ground, because Ukrainians seem to be rather good at protecting themselves on the ground, I would suggest.
Well, the question is being asked precisely along these lines, one keeps reading about Ukraine only being Putin's first territorial grab and that the Baltic states may be next. If Putin decides that Trump will not come to the aid of Europe, do you believe that Putin is looking to re-establish the Soviet Empire and potentially beyond that? Well, that is the basic question, which there's no answer to. But the debate about European security hinges on how you analyze these things, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I think it's also to Evie's point about publics, where publics are at. This it's a long-term commitment for Europeans to secure themselves, and it's a great resource commitment on the part of Europeans to secure themselves. And the Putin regime is rearming rather than just sort of sitting back and seeing its military degraded. So as we've seen sort of publicly, many analysts have warned us that Russia would have was able to regenerate its armed forces on a much quicker timescale than we might have hoped. But it all comes for Europeans. I think it all comes back to this question of how we're able to organize ourselves without the predictability of the role of the US that we've had in the past, as the question asks, and that's almost certainly going to be there with future presidents, right? And NATO, has not been really tested in the formal sense as to the reason why it was established in terms of dealing with that direct military threat from Russia or the Soviet Union, as was on NATO members. And will it be up to the task? Well, it only had to be up to the task of deterring, and we've clearly moved beyond the position in which Putin and Russia's calculations about deterrence are what they used to be.
Do you think there is such a thing as a European debate about these things? I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that you said there was a renationalization of debate about these things, and national conversations, which Evie is calling for, also national conversations. They're not European ones for the moment, because each country is looking at its own perspective and its own budgetary constraints and its own view of itself. How do you Europeanize these debates?
Yeah, I mean, I think it cuts in both ways. I think you're right that where do you find the European debate? You don't find it within the Brussels Beltway. I would suggest there's a particular debate about the role of Europe. But I think the interesting thing is the extent to which we have a very strong shared security culture, and security elites in many European states are thinking and using the same language and grappling with the same issues. And that's not to be underestimated. I think that they share that analysis, they share that outlook. And the tricky thing for them is to, in a way, persuade their political masters to hold the line and to allocate the resources that are necessary for defense. And that's not going to be an easy job at all, I think. And I think that some institutions may help, but institutions only work if there's a clear sense of what the collective purpose should be, and that's why I'm a little bit skeptical about whether the EU is the best container to do that. And that's not just because the position of the UK. I think it's just because the way the EU is organised and what it's organised for, and what it's good at. And what it's less good at, and I don't think it's an organisation that's designed really to provide the kind of defence and security posture that Europe needs.
Is it perhaps an advantage for the UK not to be in the EU for these debates, so it doesn't sit in the middle of all of these things, but it has a more outside perspective?
I'm tempted to pass that difficult question to Evie.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I have thoughts on it, which is that to some degree, there are always, the benefit for the UK of being outside of the EU is that it has its own voice, and I actually think in a lot of conversations that is useful because you have you have an extra voice, particularly when it comes to things like Ukraine, that's not the EU talking quite loudly, and we would otherwise be subsumed within the EU, and you wouldn't have that. So when you're having negotiations with the United States, for example, and trying to get them to be more on board with the European approach to Ukraine, there can be value in that. The flip side is that we are already seeing that while all of the countries, and I think this speaks to the challenge around kind of acting collectively and not just in national interest. You've seen that with the Safe Defence Fund, where the UK not being in the EU has really limited its ability to be able to engage with that. And that's despite Germany, for example, pushing very hard for the UK being able to access that fund. And it comes down to French national interest, if we're being brutally honest, and the French wanting to have and protect their own defence industry. And that's understandable. And I'm pretty sure the UK in France's position would do the exact same. But it speaks to the challenge we have around we are all too small to act solely in our national interest on this stuff, but that is where we are at, and that is where, you know, the way our democracies and everything work mean that we will continue to be like that. And I think that's the case until there is a really severe threat across Europe. I'm hoping that never comes, and so that the challenge will remain, but the worst extremities of the challenge won't. On the question of whether Putin will invade a number of other countries, I think the risk is real enough that we should be prepared in case it happens. I don't necessarily think it will. I think that realistically, you know, Putin, Russia has kind of recalibrated more quickly than we would like, but it is, you know, it's been a long slog. Originally, they thought they would go into Ukraine and be out again in 5 minutes, and it's taken a while. It hasn't necessarily had that much support. It has some support in Russia, but not unilateral. And I think it's a big endeavor to try and continue that. The flip side is, as you say, you know, Trump hasn't come to Ukraine's aid and won't in the future for any other country. And Europe has been slow to respond. Nevertheless, I would say, in broad sense, I don't think it will happen, but there's enough of a risk and far more risk than we've had at any other point in time that actually we should be collectively kind of recalibrating and being willing to commit to defence. And as Richard says, as much as anything, that's a challenge around political will and public will, which we just haven't won the debate on yet. We haven't moved the dial on. And if you ask across Europe, there isn't enough of a sense of threat for us to collectively respond to a threat from Putin. And so we do need to quite quickly shift some of that narrative and effectively mobilise the whole of society.
Well, in Germany, there's a long-running complaint that the government doesn't listen enough to what East Europeans are saying, what the Baltic states are saying, Poland, etc. It's not really taken seriously in Berlin, and that there should be much more conversations involving these countries and these societies. Is that something you would say for the UK too?
Yes, I mean, I don't think the UK really listens to anyone in Europe apart from France and Germany, and occasionally one or two others in Ukraine, of course. But I don't think it thinks enough about the challenges they're facing. And I think actually, the more we did, what we would have a much greater sense of the threat and the challenges, and we would also have much better approaches, for example, to national resilience than we currently do. So there are lots of lessons that we can learn from many of these countries. I think Finland is probably, and Sweden are some of the best examples of other countries in Europe that are doing really great things that we just aren't listening to because we are used to listening to UK, France, Germany on this. So we're not getting that sense of threat, and we're not learning the lessons from countries that are thinking far more strategically and long term about some of these challenges.
I mean, a few years ago, the UK was far ahead of Germany in helping Ukraine and was sending weapons when Germans were still agonizing about these things. Is there any field where you see the UK in a position to provide leadership in Europe right now? That's a question for both of you.
I mean, you know, I think the Ukraine point's a good one, Dominic. And I've just finished a book looking at, you know, the sort of UK's position in support for Ukraine. And what's really striking is two things. One, you know, it was the earliest adopter of Ukraine, of all European states, you know, right back to 2014 in terms of meaningful military support. but also that the Brexit process was not in any way disruptive of that, and the cross-party consensus held up all the way through the Brexit process, and that, and in a way, Ukraine has provided the UK with a bit of an easy solution to, so what's the UK's place in Europe, and trying to think through how you organize European security in a way that best supports Ukraine. That's the upside. The downside is that, I think we in the UK, we still lack a sense of, so what is the UK's place in Europe beyond security and defence, and to which an attractive answer is around the EU, but it's a difficult argument to advance. The question of rejoining the EU, is something personally I wouldn't want to see preoccupy us for an extended period of time. And I think it would be better to have a more fruitful conversation about how we see ourselves in Europe and what our contribution might be, and so on, and so on. But I would also, if I may, to be controversial, suggest that also might be a good conversation to have within Brussels in particular, but also into one or two other capitals. I mean, the UK is logically the European Union's most important ally. And the relationship should be one that looks like an alliance with a small a, not an alliance like the transatlantic alliance. But it doesn't look and feel like that. And that to me is absurd when you think that, both the UK and the EU are pointed in the same direction on Ukraine in particular, pretty much pointed in the same direction on Russia, both going through the anxiety process about the US. But we don't really have the place and space and even the language, I think, to adequately reflect how we should relate to one another without sort of falling back on the question of membership, non-membership, and Brexit. But there may be cleverer minds on this call that have got that particular issue solved. But I don't sense myself that we're having the conversation that we need to have about that relationship in a fruitful and mutually productive way.
Okay, Evie?
Yeah, I mean, and just to echo on that, I think one of the big challenges we're seeing is around trade, where that feels like the natural home for kind of the relationship to go moving forwards, particularly at a point where economies across Europe are having economic challenges, particularly in the context of the Iran war. Nevertheless, I think there are far more challenges around that conversation than there are on defence, because is it the UK has to join a single market, customs union? Is it doesn't have to do that, but it can have a Norwegian model. What does it look like in practice? And I think that's really tricky. And if we look at how difficult the conversation on defence has been, you realise how difficult it would be to get a kind of a proper trade agreement over the line. So I do think it remains a fraught relationship, and in many ways it is a bit like a jilted relationship where people aren't quite over the Brexit years and the kind of heartache of that. And I think particularly it's always striking that you hear that whenever I speak to sort of a European ambassador here in London, the kind of pining for the UK to rejoin is always there. And I think that's understandable and it makes sense, but it's also not why the kind of political mood is in the UK. And I think even people that would like to be back in the EU do not want that conversation opened up again, not least because of kind of all the trauma that it caused here domestically. And so we do have the challenge of trying to find routes where we can cooperate with Europe, and defence is the kind of easiest option in many ways, but we've seen how hard that's been as well. So I think we have to be realistic about how close they will go at this point in time, despite the fact that it would clearly make the most sense, and the more we could kind of all think in a more constructive, collaborative manner, the better for us all.
Right. We're moving to the end of our allotted time. Maybe I can just pose one question for brief answers to both of you, because here in Berlin we're following with fascination what's going on in London and all this stuff about Peter Mandelson and all that, and the questions, of course, are being asked whether the government will still be around in, say, a year's time. or whether we'll have to have this conversation with somebody completely different. What do you think?
I think if you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said that Keir Starmer would probably survive at least another year or two, not least because the Iran war was putting a lot of kind of domestic pressure on, and it wasn't the time for people to change leader. I think the most recent Mandelson stuff has caused more challenge and upset for him. I think it's caused a big rift between him and the civil service, which will create practical challenges a day to day, but it's more the political upset that it's causing within his cabinet that's the challenge. I think we will see it when the local elections happen in 3 weeks' time, to see if he survives that. If he survives that, I think he's here for at least another year or two, not least because no one really wants the leadership right now. The UK is having a number of challenges, and with the Iran war as well, it's a very difficult time economically. So I think there are a few that are desperately trying to become a leader at this moment in time. So I think he would survive that if he gets through the locals, but the local elections aren't looking particularly promising for Labour Party.
Okay, Richard, what's your take?
Listen, I think we need a second prime minister. I'd be quite happy for Starmer to still run our foreign policy, because I mean I think we have to give quite a lot of credit to him and the Labour government for their foreign policy over the last couple of years. But clearly, in terms of domestic politics and winning another general election for the Labour Party, at some point they're going to have to change the leadership, and it's just a question of when, I suppose, for the Labour Party and their calculations. But one thing I have felt over the last week or so is actually a sort of a certain sense of pride in the way that both Parliament and the civil service and all that have sort of acquitted themselves. That the Prime Minister has been held to account. And Parliament, which is a multi-party committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, have done their job in terms of interrogating and continue to interrogate witnesses. So after what has been a difficult period for British democracy, around the Brexit issue, I mean it's quite good to see that some aspects of the British political system, and particularly Parliament, are in pretty good health, even if the Prime Minister looks to be politically terminally ill.
Yes, certainly fascinating times and possibly more to come. I end on that and say thank you to everyone who's taken part, and especially thank you for the two of you. And I'll hand back to Tamara to close.
Thank you so much to all of you, to Evie, Dominic, and Richard, for your really interesting insights. And yes, we at the British German Association hope to see you in the audience at another event. And I hope you all have a good evening. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.